Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second day of St. Cloud Career Week. I have with us today David and Corey again from Minnesota Labor and Industry and the Department of Labor. Today we're going to be talking about wage theft and hours, work made simple. This is the part 2 of our Employer Lunch and Learn series. As I have up on the screen right now, you can see the agenda for today in the orange there. If you have questions for David or Corey, go ahead and place them in the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. If you're new to Teams, you'll see that there is a thumbs up sign, and if you're of my generation, you will see that thumbs up looks kind of like the Fonzie sign. Go ahead and click that if you like that question, and we'll sort of prioritize those according to the number of thumbs up signs, and make sure that those questions get answered by our 2 experts with us today. And we're going to go ahead and get started. I think David is probably going first, and we will go ahead and get started with David's presentation. All right, it's all yours, David.
Okay, I think here. Let me know.
Yep, you're down. I'm down. There you go. You're up.
Is it showing? Okay.
Yep.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah. Hello, everyone, and it's good to see you again if you're here yesterday. And again, I'm Dave Scovold. I work with the Department of Labor and Industry in the Labor Standards Division. So I'm presenting on the Wage Theft Prevention Act that passed last year. The term wage theft, of course, kind of means different things to different people. You know, from the department's point of view, we now have this law that kind of defines it for us. But essentially, in a lot of ways, the basic way that people think about wage theft is unpaid wages. So it's not really a new thing in terms of what the department itself is working on. Of course, you know, we enforce minimum wage over time, those laws. So, you know, if an employer was not paying minimum wage, that was an unpaid wage situation prior to this law. So we're going to talk about what the law did last year, and of course we're going to review over the employee notice requirements, which has been kind of the number one question area. And so we'll go through it. We have 2 days. I'm going to do more or less a half hour, and then whatever I have left, I'll leave for tomorrow, and then I'll add some additional information tomorrow. So let's jump into it. Did that move forward? It did. Okay, great. So I already showed this more or less this slide yesterday. These are the laws that are enforced by the Labor Standards Division. It's the wage and hour division on the state level. And this slide I like a lot because it reminds us, and I brought this up yesterday, but it reminds us about the different enforcement agencies, that there's these different levels of enforcement of wage and hour laws. So this, you know, it can come in a lot of different angles. And, you know, I know that you all are in the St. Cloud area, but, you know, the city of Minneapolis, which is listed there, they did pass their own wage theft ordinance last year. And it has essentially the same requirements as the state law, but there's a few differences. So if you do have any operations in Minneapolis, any employees in Minneapolis, I would encourage you to review those requirements. They do have a really nice web page that you can get information from or call them. All right, look at that transition. All right, so hours worked. This is going to be what Corey is going to be. Corey's going to be going over the hours worked issue quite extensively later in this hour. So I'm just going to give you the preview and touch on it from a state point of view. But we often find that hours that should be paid are not being paid, and they kind of fall into these groupings that are listed here on this slide. And so these are areas where employers make mistakes, where they don't, you know, again, they don't pay wages that should be paid, or they underpay. Possibly they're not paying the minimum wage for something like a training time. They give a stipend or something like that for a certain amount of time instead of an hourly wage. So Let's take just an example. I used to work with some industrial laundries, and I would often see that employees would come in before their shift, clean and prep their area at their kind of their station, more or less, from the last shift. This was this particular plant that I'm thinking about was a 24-hour plant, so it had 3 shifts. So the previous person was kind of leaving, and possibly they had it set up for themselves, and each person wanted it set up. So this set up so they could work effectively, and the employees would oftentimes come in prior, set up their station, maybe 10 minutes working on it, getting it ready, and then they would go punch in and start moving, right? So those should be work hours. Those are hours, time that's done for the employer to prep and be ready to have a successful shift. So those are hours that were often not getting recorded, and because the employee was punching in after doing that, right? So I mean, if you look at it as a one-time thing, 10 minutes, not a big deal, right? But it's that cumulative every day, and you multiply that times however many employees are in a plant, and that does add up to a lot of hours and a lot of time. So it's things like that oftentimes get missed. And if there was an audit by my agency or the federal side, those are the kinds of things we do ask employees questions about. Are you working before your shift or after your shift, and things like that. So the other categories there, Corey's going to review on the federal side how those hours are seen and how they're kind of looked at. And the state, for the most part, really sees each of these categories in the same way. So as Corey describes them, you can think about that. The State Department of Labor and Industry would also review those issues similarly. This one, again, I touched on yesterday. I'll just say again that final pay, that final paycheck, that is oftentimes the most common thing that we receive calls about on a weekly basis. So, if you're going to terminate somebody, if you're planning on, obviously, if it's on the spot, it's hard. But if you're planning to terminate somebody, probably the best practice kind of thing is making sure that you're prepping that paycheck, making sure that you're reviewing to see if they have deductions that need to come back to them. That way you're prepared if you do get that 24-hour demand or request. All right, and before we get into the new law, this is the last slide, I think, talking about something else that's related, and that is overtime. So this is to note, again, that the state and the federal have different overtime laws. Minnesota is one of the only states that has a different overtime amount threshold from federal. So federal's at 40, and that's kind of the, what we all are very familiar with. And most employers are subject to federal law. So, the state law doesn't really apply to most employers, but there are a number of employers that are exempt from federal law that are not exempt from state law. And that happens most commonly probably with agriculture. Agricultural employers are not exempt on the state level, but federally, oftentimes they are exempt. It also can happen with smaller businesses. So those that are federally exempt because they have gross revenues that are under that $500,000 threshold and don't meet the other interstate commerce requirements, those might also fall under that state 48-hour amount. So when we investigate cases, we hold, we're able to hold to that 48-hour amount. So oftentimes, if we do get a call from a worker, we're referring those calls out to the federal side.
So Dave,
yeah,
we had a question come in. So if an employee comes in early and starts work early, but it wasn't requested or directed by the employer, does that still count?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I know that Corey's going to be, that's part of the presentation that he discusses, that exact same thing. But yes, I mean, yes, employers are responsible for any hours that are worked, regardless of whether they've asked them to be worked or not. So that can be a difficult situation. And again, I think, from an investigative standpoint, we would take into consideration whether this is a one-time, type of event, or is this a repetitive, ongoing thing that the employer, could have, should have been aware of, type of thing. But yes, those hours are work. As long as their hours worked, the law doesn't differentiate whether the employer asked them to be worked or not. All right, so the Wage Theft Prevention Act, here's kind of the overview of what we're going to discuss here on that. It all went into effect last year. So while it's still new and fresh, and I think a lot of employers are still learning about the requirements and how to manage and keep track of the employee notice requirements, it did go into effect basically immediately. That's the way the legislature set it up, so last summer. So here's that employee notice that I keep talking about, and there was a few questions that came up on the employee notice in the chat yesterday, and so it's we've all been focusing on coronavirus related things, so in a certain way it's nice to get back to talking about this because it is still new, and I think, yeah, like I said, a lot of employers are still getting the practice of what's the easiest way to implement this. So the employee notice, the concept here, and this is again is part of this Wage Theft Prevention Act, and that is that employees will receive the basic terms of employment when they start work. So how much they will be paid, who is the employer they work for, where is the employer, what's the employer's actual address. Let's say that it could be something that where you're working out in the field, you don't know what the address of the employer is. What are the wage rates you're eligible for? Are you eligible for paid time off? If you are, how does that work? So it's kind of that basic information. In a lot of ways, employers are most likely giving this information to get already, but this ensures that they're giving it, and it also has the employee sign off on it. So what we have on the screen here is the example notice that's on DLI's website. One of the comments yesterday in the chat also talked about that somebody was having difficulty filling out part of it, or that one of the sections wasn't, I guess, fillable or something like that. So that's feedback that we do want to receive. It is in Word, so the Word version you should be able to manipulate pretty easily. The PDF is supposed to be a fillable document. I know we did make an edit to it recently, so I'm sure it's not perfect, but these are example notices. The employers are not required to use DLI's notice. You can, and if you do use it, you're going to be, that's a notice that's in compliance. But you can create your own notice, and you just need to make sure that you include all the elements that are required in the notice, which we're going to be going over in the next couple slides. The other thing is that if you do get a request for it in a different language, we already have this form translated in 13 other languages, 13 other other common second languages. So you could use that. That's on our website. Another question that comes up often is, again, when we're talking about the employer creating their own notice, do I have to create my own notice, or can I convert something else that I'm already using, like an offer letter, handbook, some other type of document that the employer may be using?Maybe it's a collective bargaining agreement. Can I convert that into something that fits the requirements of the notice? And you could, as long as it includes what's required, you can convert something else. You just need to make sure that you have everything that needs to be there. And as an example, something that sometimes is not there is a signature that the employee is signing off on that. So you may be issuing that other type of document, but you weren't having the employee sign off on it, so you may you would want to add that to that document.
So David.
Yeah.
I think you answered this, but I want to make sure that it's clear.
Yeah.
Do you suggest using the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry employee notice form, or can an employer use their own form with the same information? But I think you just answered that for that employer.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like one of those things that is really up to the employer. What's the easiest way to do it? Some employers are creating these electronically, and then you have the electronic signature instead of so that's, once you kind of have that in, you know, that's one way of doing it. Some are using probably the department's notice initially as they kind of build their own system. And I think smaller employers are probably more likely to use the notice from the department, so they don't have to create their own. And larger employers that have more resources or time to build their own that fits, are more likely to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk about this slide, and I know it's a lot kind of wordy here, so I wish I had something more interesting to look at. But this slide talks about, we're starting to talk about what's in the notice, right? So there's a lot of questions we received about the how to fill out the notice. So the first sub-bullet point here, it says the employee's employment status and whether an employee is exempt from minimum wage, overtime, and other state wage and hour laws, and on what basis, right? So that's not so straightforward. It's a little, it makes you ask yourself, what does that mean? And so you can see below that, it talks about where somebody might look in statutes 177 and chapters 5200, et cetera, right? So what this is asking us is, again, is the person an exempt employee or a non-exempt employee? And they're not only asking us that question, they're asking that under state law, are they exempt or non-exempt? So we have federal exemptions, which I think Corey is going to be talking about tomorrow. We have federal exemptions, and then we have state exemptions, right? And so for some, essentially the exemption means if somebody's exempt, that means that they are not required to pay overtime. So they, as we know that, I think most people know that. And additionally, they're not required to pay minimum wage, which people probably didn't know that as much. Most likely there's still always going to be, you do the calculation, the minimum wage is probably going to be paid based on a salary and hours worked, but it's possible you could have somebody working 100 hours a week, and if you do calculate that out based on their salary, it'd be under the minimum wage. So it does. So where you would find that information is, again, in 177.23, which is the Minnesota Fair Labor Standards Act. That's what governs minimum wage and overtime, as well as those chapters 5200, those spots that are listed there. And the 5200, it reviews the executive, administrative, and professional tests on a state level. And those are similar to the federal, those three federal categories. And what it's a duties test, more or less. So what are the duties that the employee work? Does the executive employee oversee other employees? Do they have the ability to hire and fire? It's those types of questions that would go into consideration. So if people have specific questions about exemptions, I would suggest they contact our office. So the couple other things here on this slide, it talks about the days in the pay period, the regularly scheduled pay period, payday, excuse me. So if you pay bi-monthly, for example, and you don't have it could be a variable amount of days, what we suggest on things like that, on how to fill out the notice, is do your best to kind of describe it, so that you would say, bi-monthly, something like that, instead of just saying the days. So you want to basically, if there's questions on this notice that you look at it and you say, well, that doesn't really fit our business, how that's asked, do your best to describe it in a way that that worker can understand how to figure out that information. Just as an example, so we had a lot of questions initially on this last one, the date the employee will receive the first payment of wages. So we had questions from school districts for substitute teachers saying, we're hiring them at the beginning of the year. We don't know when they'll take their first assignment. So our guidance was, well, describe to them when the pay periods are, and then they would be able to figure out based on when they start, when they're being paid first.
So David, can an employer remove information from the employee notice that doesn't actually apply to their company or to a specific job?
Yeah, absolutely. So the example, the Word document, if an employer just wants to grab that and use that as a template and manipulate it and change it around and Again, as long as the required elements are there. I mean, I know there are some questions on there that aren't required. For example, like at the top, it says the employee's phone number, right? So of course, probably an employer is going to want to know what the employee's phone number is, but it's not required under state law to be on the notice. So we put some of those questions on there, like the employee's phone number, because we knew that a lot of employers were using this to replace other new hire documents. But if you don't have a need for it on there, feel free to take that off as an example and switch it and change it around.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. So this also talks about the pay rates here at the top. So this one I want to just give an example of. Let's say you have a manufacturing employer that has a weekend differential. You may have an individual who's hired on as a machine operator, but possibly that person is also going to be filling in as a welder on occasion. So on that initial notice, the employer would likely want to list, let's say there was a pay rate for $20 an hour for the machine operator and $21 an hour for the welder when you're working that position. The employer would likely want to list both of those pay rates in that initial notice, so that when that employee does take that welder shift, they've already been informed of that pay rate. It's already documented in writing. And then the employer would not have to go back and re-inform that employee of the different rate. And we'll talk about that on the next slide, if what happens or what the procedure is if there's a rate of pay change. And I touched on that yesterday. So listing all those different potential rates there on that initial notice saves time later on for the employer to if there's a change in a shift or there's a change in a position or something like that. Of course, employers can't see the future and know everything that's going to happen, but the more one of the ways that employers can save time with this notice process is by giving the employee more information of possible outcomes or possible future situations that may arise. So when it comes to the second bullet point here, it talks about the permitted meals and lodging, and that is something that's not very common, but it's a credit employers can take if they're providing meals and lodging, and it's a credit against the minimum wage. So I have yet to run across an employer that's taking this credit, but if you want to learn more about it, you can see in that chapter 5200. All right, so moving on with another thing that we've had a lot of questions on, and that's this first bullet point here and related to paid time off. So a couple things I'll say about that. So the notice, the example notice says, does the employer offer any type of paid time off, whether that's sick, PTO, vacation, other types of things, names or ways that people might describe that. And then what are the terms of use? So there's I think one line for it, what are the terms of use? And that's, I think everybody would agree, that's not something that you could describe in one line or two lines. So the employer's option might be what you said, Kelly. They could take that Word document and expand it there and put that in there. The employer could also attach a copy of a PTO policy. They could reference a handbook. We do ask that the reference be to a specific location, for example, like see Chapter 5 of handbook or the Article 7 of a collective bargaining agreement, something like that. But the other advantage of listing or referencing something else that hopefully the employee would need to have been provided, that other policy document, right, is that oftentimes there's a schedule there, right? And it's possible you're going to have a salary schedule too, especially if you're working with a collective bargaining agreement type situation. But on PTO or paid time off, that's pretty common that there's a schedule, right? So I've worked 1 year, I'm hired on now, and I'm going to receive 5 PTO days for my first day. As soon as I hit my 1 year anniversary, I'm going to be bumped up to 8 days, right? So that's probably all listed in the PTO policy. and the employer does not need to go back and re-inform me that I'm being bumped from 5 to 8 days at the end of my first year, because they've already given me that information, right? So that's a key thing, is again related to changes, is if you've given that information, you've provided that information to the employee, you don't need to go back and re-inform the employee at the point that change happens.
David, how would a staff, I got a little echo, sorry. How
Yeah.
would a staffing company go about providing that form when you have day labor where they would work maybe multiple positions and maybe have multiple wage levels for those positions? So then how do you fill out one of those employee notice forms? Because it would depend on daily assignments and the conditions for those daily assignments.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it does get more complicated the more potential scenarios that are there, and different pay rates and positions. But the employer could come up with a document that lists all those different positions, and then attach it or give it to the employee when they give out the notice. So that way, all those scenarios are covered right away, and then just use that document for the different, all the different employees, for example. You may have maybe there's a couple different documents. Maybe there's a document for each employer that that agency would send somebody to. But yeah, that does get a little more complicated. That does relate to kind of the next point I was going to make, and it's the deductions. So you can see on the bullet points here, and I'll bring it back to your question. It says a list of the deductions that may be made from the employee's pay. And so with that, we can kind of, our mind might wander and say, well, there's a lot of different types of things that could be a deduction, right? So what I've seen most employers do in that to cover that requirement is to come up with kind of a comprehensive list that would cover different employees, different types of job classifications, and then give that out to those, and say these are the deductions that may be made. So, which could include things like garnishments. It could include things like child support, things that are more sometimes, based on the individual, but it's something that may happen, right? It may happen. So, similarly with your question, the employer could come up with such a document or a list of the different wage rates. So, if somebody's working one job and it's an hourly wage, that's the simplest scenario, right? But oftentimes there's different pay rates, there's incentives they're eligible for, they may be eligible for commissions. There's a scenario of different things. So employers are probably going to want to try to come up with, if they don't have that already, some type of document that covers those different things.
So then when you give an employee a employee notice, do you have to provide the entire PTO schedule at hire? Like, for example, one of our employers does a 0 to 2 year and gets safe and sick PTO or plus PTO, but only PTO from 2 to 5 years. Couldn't you just give them a new notice, since some people negotiate additional PTO at starting time?
Yeah, I mean, the notice itself is based on the individual. So it's really the individual's scenario. If it's if me, Dave, let's say that Kelly, you hire me, what's the PTO that I'm going to be eligible for, right? So if you want to just list that what I'm eligible for, because maybe it's different throughout throughout the company, and that there's different scenarios, and you're not sure what you want to, you're going to have to figure out in my annual review what I'm going to be eligible for next year, then you probably want to do it on a more individual basis. If you kind of have across the board, this is the policy for everybody, and here's the schedule, and it's not really going to be changing, then more likely you might want to give out that whole thing, because then that again prevents the employer from having to go back and re-inform the employee when there is a change in my schedule.
And then when you do when you talk about deductions, are you including whether or not they elect insurance kinds of things too?
Yeah, so any type of deduction, even if it's optional, even if it's government, different, some type of level of government required. So the employer doesn't need to go through and list, for example, if somebody's getting family coverage or single coverage on health insurance, but just saying health insurance would be sufficient to inform the employee that that's a possible deduction, or something like that.
And do employers need to go back and provide employee notices for all existing employees?
Great question. So this, this is a question that's come up a lot, and it is the initial notice. This initial notice is only required for employees that started July 1, 2019 or after. So we have seen many employers just issue it to everyone, and that's something that you could do, but it's only required for July 1, 2019 or after, those employees that started after that. Now the change notice portion of it is required for all employees. So that gets a little confusing. Let's jump to the next slide. Well, I think it's another slide where we'll get to that. But so the change notice is the section that talks about if there's a change in the notice, how does the employer handle that, right? So I'll go a couple more slides, and then I'm going to turn over to Corey for the rest of the hour, and then I'll pick this up tomorrow. So
okay,
the employee notice is, again, there is a language requirement. So if the employee asks to have the document in another language, then the employer is required to provide it in that other language. That is one of the advantages of using, or you can use the DLI translated notice forms. We have tried to put it in a format that's a lot of check boxes and just filling out like a name or some simple information, so there would be less translation that would be needed down the line. But this is on the example employee notice. This box is on page 2. And so if the employer does decide to come up with their own form, they would need to include this language in this box in that form. So you can cut and paste this into your document. If you have any trouble tech-wise with that, please contact us and we can try to help with that. So when it comes to requirements with the notice, additionally, it's that the employee sign it. And again, electronic signatures are okay. And then that, again, here's the part where it talks about the second bullet point. If there's any changes, that the notice is given to the employee of the changes before the changes take effect. So as an example, on October 1st, Kelly, you decided to give me a raise. I'm going to go from $10 to $11 an hour, and I'm celebrating. And I've also now received an email that tells me of this change. The employer is going to keep a copy of that email showing that they inform me in writing of that change, and then we're all good to go, right? So part of the challenge for employers is figuring out kind of a storage system, or how to keeping track of, this is Dave's original notice, and then for the 10 years I've worked here, the next 10 years, here's my pay rate changes, here's the different things I've been informed about. Some of that information might have been like a company-wide, where there was a change company-wide. Some of it might have been on an individual basis, right? So that is a challenge for employers to kind of figure out that tracking system for that employee notice. So I'll leave it there for today, and then pick up tomorrow. Does that sound good? All right, so I'm going to stop sharing, Corey. So you can...
$11 an hour for Dave? That's a little steep.
It's high, I know, but.
Yeah.
And Dave, there are a couple of questions that we didn't get to in the Q&A, so if you could do those for us, that'd be awesome.
Okay, I'll try to type those in. Otherwise, I'll try to answer them tomorrow.
All right, thank you.
Kelly, David, can you guys see my PowerPoint?
I can.
Great. So good afternoon again, everyone. This is Corey Waltman with the U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division. And I love doing this presentation right after Dave talks about wage theft, because the two are closely connected now, and I'll show you what I mean. But first, I just want to make sure everyone knows today I'm gonna focus on the Fair Labor Standards Act. So yesterday I talked about the FFCRA and the paid leave sick provisions. Today I'm going to talk about the Fair Labor Standards Act, and in particular I'm going to focus on hours worked. So Dave talked earlier about the difference between state and federal law. Overtime after 48 hours in a week under state, and overtime after 40 hours under federal law. And employers sometimes can have questions, or there could be some uncertainty about which law applies, which one do I have to focus on, etc. So the reason why it's important for me to talk about the Fair Labor Standards Act is so I can bring in the answer the questions about when does federal law apply, and just make it clear to everyone that's when they have to pivot to the after 40 instead of the after 48. So it's important to understand how state and federal sort of overlap, so you know exactly which one to hone in on when you're talking about compliance. So Fair Labor Standards Act, basically we're talking about minimum wage, overtime, child labor or youth employment, and record keeping. I'm not going to cover all of those issues today. Today I'm going to concentrate on hours worked. But the first thing I want to clear up is any employer who wonders whether or not his or her company is subject to the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act. And so there's two types of coverages that would apply if the federal law applies. There's either enterprise coverage or individual coverage. I want to make sure everyone understands how both of those concepts apply. First, enterprise coverage. If an enterprise is covered, all employees of the enterprise, so all locations and all work weeks, all employers are going to be subject to federal overtime and federal wage and hour requirements. Individual coverage could also apply. So if it's a smaller business, it's not covered by enterprise-wide, and I'll show you what that means in a second, then there could be, like Dave mentioned earlier, there could be some individuals who are engaged in what we determine to be interstate commerce activities, and they as individuals could be subject to overtime requirements under federal law and the rest of the federal law requirements. So enterprise coverage or individual coverage. Let's talk about enterprise first. It's a simple two-pronged test. If the enterprise has at least 2 employees and does at least $500,000 gross each year in business, then they're going to be covered by federal law. That's a simple two-pronged test. It's pretty straightforward. And again, it's important to know when you meet that threshold, because if you've been paying overtime after 48 under state law, let's say your business grew over time, and now you're over that threshold, you have to make sure you pivot and you're in compliance with the overtime after 40 now. But under enterprise coverage, there's also this concept called what we call named enterprises. So named enterprises are going to be covered enterprise-wide just based on the type of industry they operate in. So for example, schools, right on the screen, nursing care facilities, government agencies, they're all going to be covered by federal law despite whether or not they meet that $500,000 threshold. They're what we call named enterprises, specifically named in the law as being covered by federal law. So that's important. Government agencies, especially in schools and nursing home and healthcare facilities, they're brought into that enterprise coverage regardless of whether or not they meet the $500,000 threshold. But let's say it's a smaller business, okay? And they're not a named enterprise and they're below the $500,000 threshold. There could be some individuals that work for that company who are going to be subject to federal law simply because of what they do. They're involved in what we call interstate commerce activities. And on the screen are some examples of those interstate commerce activities. Just particular focus is things you see every day. So if an employee, for example, works for a hotel that's below that $500,000 threshold, but they're a front desk clerk and they're swiping credit cards on a daily basis. So in the second to the last dash there, they would fall into that category, processing credit card transactions on a regular basis. So it has to be not every now and then, but it's part of their regular duties. Or traveling back and forth from out of state, calling back and forth from calling folks from other states, whether you're ordering goods or doing business transactions or whatever. So all of these interstate commerce activities are also going to be covered. And just to make mention of that top bullet, domestic service workers are going to be brought in as individually covered simply because of what they do. Production of goods for commerce. So just be aware there's a lot of activities that individuals could be doing if they work for smaller employers who are not covered under the enterprise-wide concept. Our DOL fact sheet number 14 is our coverage fact sheet. It's sort of kind of, if you want to kind of go over what I said as far as coverage, you can look that fact sheet up or go to our website and you'll have that information. Okay, so this is my favorite part of the Fair Labor Standards Act. This is the hours work section. And Dave knows I get excited when I talk about hours work. And this is why I do get excited. He's right, but there's a reason. Dave talked about wage theft earlier. A lot of times employers will interpret wage theft as taking from the employee's wages deliberately or in some type of sinister way. And that still happens. But most of the time, hours worked issues that turn into overtime violations are what we see in the field. So let me give you a quick example and then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So let's say the employer has a meal break policy where employees get 30 minutes each day for their meal, and the software system automatically deducts 30 days for all employees for their meal period. Let's say for whatever reason, the employees don't get 30 minutes every day. Maybe 2 days or 3 days out of the week, their meal period is interrupted. Under federal law, that meal period should then be compensated. So you have someone who's already at 40 hours a week and they should have been compensated. Let's say they should have been compensated for 2 meal periods. So that's an hour, 30 minutes times 2. That's a 41-hour week now. That's an overtime violation. That's a 1 hour of overtime that was missed because the employer didn't keep track of those missed hours worked. So that's what a violation looks like a lot of times in the real world. It's not so much an employee just wage theft as we think of wage theft almost intuitively, that someone's taking something from someone else. It could be something like this that slips through the cracks. And so that's what I want to put on everyone's radar. David talked about earlier some of these issues that I would kind of zoom in on, and I'm going to do that right now because these are what we see. I'm going to talk about the things. I was an investigator for 15 years. I'm going to talk about the things I saw the most, and so that way you guys can like go back and when you're talking about it to employers or whatever, just keeping track of these red flag issues. It can save a lot of liability, overtime liability. Okay, so suffered or permitted. This came up when David was talking. The question was asked, what if an employee works hours for which he or she was not authorized or approved to work? And Dave's answer was spot on. If the hours of work, they have to be paid. Employers often say, and it's often the case, I know this for a fact, I saw it with my own two eyes during investigations. Sometimes employees do work hours that they're not supposed to work. That does happen, or you can't babysit employees that closely sometimes. And my answer to the employer was this: you can discipline them any other way for any other rule they keep breaking. So for example, someone habitually comes to work late. You have ways to discipline them based on that infraction. But one way you can't discipline them is to withhold their wages. So if they work the hours, they got to be paid. However, you have to deal with them not working hours that you didn't authorize them to work, you're free to do, but you have to pay them for the time when they're working. So that's essentially what suffered or permitted means. If the hours of work, they had to be paid. I'm going to talk a little bit about waiting time. I want to skip on call this time, but on call does become an issue for a lot of employers. So if you do have an on call issue, it's usually fact specific. So I'd be happy to answer that if anyone has any questions, or there's some more information on our fact sheet number 22 about on call time. I'm going to talk about meal and rest periods because that's a common violation area. I'll also talk about training time, travel time, and I'll skip sleep time because that is more an industry specific issue. For example, the healthcare industry. So let's dive into some of these issues right off the bat.
Corey?
Sure.
We had a question come in. What if an employee meal break was not interrupted? However, they decided to, on their own accord, to return to work before their 30-minute meal period was up?
Back on the clock. I can talk about meal periods right now since it's come up because it makes sense. It's only a couple of slides from here, so I can touch on that issue right now. So it's clear. It must be clear. I make this point real clear. Under federal law, a meal period is not required in the first place. So there's no federal requirement that employees give meal periods. That usually happens on the state level. But what we say, the feds, we say is once you give a meal period, it has to be at least 30 minutes continuous and uninterrupted. So it can't be 10 minutes interruption, come back and do 20, or it can't be 15 interruption, 15. If it's not 30 continuous and uninterrupted, it should be paid, right? If an employee, for example, in this question that was just asked, let's say an employee in an unauthorized manner goes back to work before they were scheduled to go back to work, that goes back to the suffered or permitted. You have to pay them, but whatever you have to do to discipline them to not do that, it's up to your policy, your disciplinary policy. But once they do that, they have to be paid. But 30 minutes continuous uninterrupted is the safe area. So let's talk a little bit about waiting time. There's two concepts under waiting time. There's engaged to wait and there's waiting to be engaged. Look at the top portion of the screen. Counted as hours worked when the employee is unable to use the time effectively for his or her own purposes and the time is controlled by the employer. That's engaged to wait. Those hours are compensable. Here's an example. Let's say a truck driver goes out of town with a load, gets to the dock, out of town destination, gets to the dock, and they tell the driver that she's the first one in line, so they'll have her downloaded and uploaded, and she can just wait in her cab for that to happen. So that employee is engaged to wait. They can't go anywhere and use that time effectively for her own purposes. So she's engaged to wait. Those hours are paid. As opposed to another truck driver gets to the destination out of town, there's 4 or 5 trucks ahead of them, and the folks working the dock say, well, why don't you just leave the truck here and come back in an hour and a half, and we'll have you all ready to go. If that employee leaves and goes to Caribou or Starbucks and does nothing that's work related, then he or she is said to be waiting to be engaged. They're not engaged to wait. So that time would not necessarily have to be paid. In the real world, practically speaking, the employer will probably pay both drivers, but I'm just telling you what the employer would be required to pay. And that bottom half of the screen is that second example where the employer was broke off for an hour and a half, did something not related to the work, and was completely relieved from duty. So engaged to wait, compensable, waiting to be engaged, non-compensable. Fact sheet 22, if this is all kind of going by you a little fast. I talked about meal and rest periods. What I didn't say is the second paragraph there. Rest periods of short duration, normally 5 to 20 minutes, are counted as hours worked and must be paid. So I guess they still call them smoke breaks. Those small little 15-minute breaks in the morning and the afternoon always should be paid, never should be deducted. There's a window there between 20 and 30, because I talked about 30 minutes or longer, continuous and uninterrupted, and this talks about 20 minutes. In between 20 minutes and 30 minutes, there's a lot of scrutiny about whether or not that can be deducted as a meal period. So I always tell employers to be safe, make it 30, but if in certain industries, a 25-minute meal period is considered adequate in that industry, we would look at other factors. Is everybody getting 25 minutes? Are people not interrupted? What was the understanding when they were hired? How long they would get? So there's several factors we look at. The scrutiny is very high in that 20 to 30-minute window. That's why I always tell employers, make it 30, you don't have to worry about it. Meal breaks. Training time. We often get questions about whether or not employers have to pay employees when they're in meetings, lectures, or some type of training. And it's considered as hours worked unless all 4 of these bullets you see on the screen are met. So the first bullet, attendance has to be outside of regular working hours. Second bullet, the attendance has to be voluntary. And voluntary doesn't mean, you can go to the training or attend the lecture if you want, but if you don't, then, you're going to go to the graveyard shift or something like that. That's not voluntary. It's got to be completely up to the employee whether or not they want to attend. Third bullet, the course, lecture, or meeting is not job related. And the last bullet, the employee does not perform any productive work during the attendance. So all of those 4 bullets or those requirements have to be met. If one fails, the test fails and that training time or meeting time or lecture time has to be paid. I often ran into this issue with sometimes healthcare facility workers have to undergo CPR or first aid on an annual or semi-annual basis, those kinds of things. And I ran into situations where they weren't paid, and none of these 4 bullets, or I should say the test was failed with one of these bullets, but the employer wasn't paying for the training. So that has to be, for example, I had a case where the training was required, so that second bullet failed. So again, these are the 4 requirements. Fact sheet 22 also has these elements.
So Corey, if a company has a required meeting over the lunch period, but they provide a meal for all their employees, can it be unpaid?
No, because they're not completely relieved from duty. So that they're still actively engaged in work. So they're going to have to be paid. I guess that would fall, if you want to see what element it falls under, it would fall under the last one. The employee does not perform any productive work during the attendance. So in a situation like that, I'd go back to the meal break, 30 minutes continuous and uninterrupted. That's them at work. That's interruption. It's not free from duty, okay. even though they're providing the meal.
The meal.
Yeah.
And then how many rest periods are allowed for these smoke breaks? If someone needs to smoke 4 times a day, are all of these covered as paid or counted as paid?
Yeah, so if they're in that short duration, 10, 15, 20 minutes, they always have to be paid regardless of the number they are. Now, it's up to the employer how many of those they want to provide. But once they provide them and they're that duration, that short duration, they have to be paid.
Okay.
I should say this too, any unauthorized extensions of meal breaks, the employer does not have to pay the employer, so an employee. So let's say, for example, the employer has a policy of 30-minute meal period each day, and that's the authorized, and some employer or many employees extend that to 45 minutes, for example. The employer wouldn't be on the hook from the 30 to the 45, even though it is 15 minutes, because it falls into that category of an unauthorized extension of an authorized break. So I want to make clear, when the employer's misconduct, but they're extending breaks where they shouldn't, even though they're only short in duration, that time does not have to be paid. This means 30 minutes. Travel time, this is the last hours worked issue. And again, I want to loop all of this back to the overtime. Again, training time that wasn't paid, pre-shift, post-shift, I didn't talk about any kind of pre-shift. Dave talked about that a little bit earlier. When you throw all of that time in to some employees whose schedule already puts them at 40 hours, that's how hours worked issues turn into overtime violations. So I want to make sure I make that connection between hours worked and overtime. Finally, travel time. We get a lot of questions about which travel time scenarios have to be paid. The first bullet, pretty much everyone knows, an ordinary home to work travel is not compensable. So Department of Labor is not going to pay me to go from my home to the office. Second bullet, travel between job sites during the normal workday is work time. So that scenario most often comes up in 2 types of circumstances. The first one is when employees on crews or for whatever industry they work on that has those type of setups, like a landscaping or construction, snow removal, where folks are going from one place to another. All of that travel in between work project sites is compensable. The second circumstance that comes up a lot is when the employees are working for an employer who has multiple establishments. So for example, an employer who owns 4 restaurants, and employees may be shuffling back and forth between restaurants during the course of a day. That's going to be travel time that's compensable as well. So travel that's between job sites during the normal workday, what we call all in the day's work travel, is compensable. The third bullet, special rules apply to travel away from the employee's home community. 2 little subcategories under that bullet. The first category is the special 1-day assignment. So sometimes employees, because of what they have to do, have to travel away from their home community on a day and then come back on the same day. And whether or not that travel, let's say if they're going from Minneapolis to Rochester to do some work for the day and coming home in the evening, and whether or not that travel is compensable. And the answer is yes, but the employer can deduct normal home to work travel from that period. So let's say it takes an employee or employees an hour and a half to get from Minneapolis to Rochester, but their normal home to work is 15 minutes. The employer would be on the hook for the hour and 15 minutes coming and going. So it's one-day assignment, special one-day assignment type scenarios. Travel time, yes, is compensable. Employer is allowed to deduct the normal home to work. And whatever reasonable calculation they use to determine what the usual home to work travel is, should be fine with us. And the one more travel time scenario that falls under that third bullet is the overnight travel. So sometimes it's necessary for employees to, for whatever reason, to go away from their home community overnight, whether it's 2 nights or 3 nights or the week, and whether or not that overnight travel is compensable. And the answer is it depends if they are a passenger or a driver. The driver, now we're talking about any mode of travel, by the way, whether it's employees in a car, in a van, they're taking a bus, they're taking a plane or whatever, any mode of travel. Passengers, drivers. The drivers are always going to be paid for that travel because they're simply substituting what they would normally do for driving activities. So they're paid. So the question becomes whether or not passengers are paid for that travel. And the answer is yes, if it cuts across their normal duty hours, and that's on any day of the week. So let's say, for example, their normal schedule is Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. Let's keep it simple. And they travel, they're required to travel on a Saturday at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, whether by car, van, bus, plane, or whatever. Since 1 o'clock is a normal work hour, even though Saturday is not a normal work day, passengers would be required to be compensated for that travel because it cuts across their normal work hours. It doesn't matter what day it's on or what their normal daily schedule is. If they travel outside of those work hours on any day of the week, let's say they travel on Saturday at 6 o'clock in the evening, then they're not required to be paid unless during that travel they're doing things that are work related. Then all bets are off, they're back on the clock. So drivers always paid for that overnight travel. Passengers are paid if it cuts across their normal working hours, and that includes any day of the week. They travel outside of those hours, they don't have to be paid unless they're doing job-related activities. Again, these travel time scenarios are on that fact sheet number 22 as well. There's some more information, or I should say where you can get some more information. The 1-866-4US wage number is our technical assistance line. I think that's also available in the chat box. But that's your first line of defense. I would definitely call the 1-866-4US wage number first. Between the hours of 8 and 4:30 would be best. That's when you'll get someone live. But yeah, if you have any questions, would be where you go to get the answers. Okay, I don't know if we have any more questions, Kelly.
Not at this time.
Okay. I hope everyone I went through that rather rapidly, but I just want to make sure everyone understands the connection between hours worked and what David talked about wage theft, because wage theft doesn't always have to be some bad employer doing something that causes some kind of harm to the employees. It can be an innocent slips through the crack type scenario, and that's what I want the employers to get out of this, or everyone to get out of this.
And Corey, I posted into the chat. I couldn't figure out how to copy
I just moved it into the Q&A so that people could see it.
Okay, so I got to figure out how to do that. But it's this on the federal, from your agency, you had this tracking of teleworkers compensable hours guidance come out in August that I thought was useful because with all the teleworking situations happening right now,
that's useful. That's a good point, David, too, and that's a good place to say this too. A lot of times now the employers are wondering, well, how can I keep track of all these hours? Everyone's working remote or away from home. Keep in mind, it's still the employer's obligation. Whatever you have to do to get that information from the employees, that's an employer obligation thing. So employers have to adjust on the fly like everyone else to get that information where normally someone would be in the office logging in or punching in or whatever. But it's still an employer obligation component, so make sure you kind of make the adjustments accordingly.
All right, everybody, we are at the end of our time. It is 12:59. Thank you for joining us today, and hopefully you'll all be back tomorrow. I have one new question that just came up. This was really great information, and thank you. That's what she's saying, or what they're saying. Thanks, guys, for joining us today. I'll see you guys tomorrow afternoon. Again, I'll send out the PowerPoint presentations, and I will send out a video link with today's presentation on it. So we will see you guys tomorrow. Have a great day. Enjoy the sunshine.
Thanks, Kelly.
Bye, guys.